On a crisp December morning, Mike Williams vanished during a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole, and authorities said that he drowned. His best friend helped lead the search, and his wife collected nearly $2 million in life insurance, but his body was never found until 17 years later. Mike didn't drown. He didn't fall. He didn't disappear. He was murdered, and the people closest to him staged the perfect accident. For nearly 2 decades, they kept their secret until one of them snapped. Today, we're going to uncover the twisted truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance, the lies that fueled a massive cover-up, and the bombshell confession that blew the case wide open. This story is currently going viral because of the Hulu documentary that just came out, so trust me, you are going to want to listen to this story. Today, you're going to learn how a husband and father became the victim of a deadly conspiracy, and how a mother's unshakable intuition brought a 17-year mystery to justice. The story isn't just about murder. It's about how far people will go for money, lust, and lies. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me a comment down below for any case recommendations that you have, and I will be sure to take a look into them. All right, everybody, let's dive into today's video. To understand the full context of today's case, we've got to go back to the very beginning. Mike Williams grew up in a modest, hardworking family in Bradfordville, Florida. Mike was outgoing, he was a driven student, and he was actually the student council president, played football, and was active in the Key Club. At age 15, he took up duck hunting, which sadly is the hobby that would later play into the fateful events that took his life. Mike met Denise Merrill in high school. Denise was part of Mike's social circle, and the two were head over heels in love, which led them to becoming high school sweethearts and eventually husband and wife. Also in their circle of friends was Brian Winchester, who attended that same school. In fact, the group formed 2 couples. Mike dated Denise, and Brian dated another friend named Kathy. They were all close, and according to everybody that knew them, this group was forging lifelong bonds. Mike and Brian were not just classmates or just a group of friends. They were best friends. After high school, Mike stayed for local college, attending Florida State University and earning a degree in political science and urban planning. He was industrious and ambitious because even before graduation, he landed a job as a property appraiser at Ketchum Appraisal Group, and his boss described him as, quote, the hardest working man he ever saw, end quote. In 1994, at the age of 24, Mike married Denise Merrill. The young couple settled in Tallahassee and soon bought a home in an upscale division on the city's east side. Mike poured himself into providing for his family. Colleagues often said that he worked late into the night, even returning to the office after dinner to get more work done that day. By 1999, they welcomed a baby girl named Ansley, who became the actual center of Mike's whole entire world. Friends described Mike as a devoted husband and an adoring father, and someone who doted on his little girl and took pride in taking care of his family. Financial security was really important to Mike. Because he enjoyed outdoorsy and sometimes risky hobbies like hunting and fishing, he wanted to ensure that his family would be taken care of if anything ever happened to him. He consulted his best friend, Brian Winchester, who actually was an insurance agent at the time. In mid-2000, just months before his own disappearance, Mike purchased a $1 million life insurance policy through Brian in addition to other policies that he actually already had in place. In total, Mike Williams was insured for about $1.75 million, which is a huge amount for a 31-year-old. As Mike's boss later noted, quote, Mike wanted to make sure that his family would be taken care of because he liked to hunt and fish and did some other pretty high-risk activities. We encouraged him to load up on insurance, end quote. No one could have predicted how crucial those policies would become or that they would become a motive for murder. Everyone said that Mike and Denise's marriage seemed really happy from the outside. They had been together since their teen years, built a beautiful life in Tallahassee, and were active in their church and community. In late 2000, they even talked about trying for a second child and had an upcoming anniversary trip planned, as well as a spring cruise coming up. But appearances can be deceiving. Unknown to Mike, Denise had not truly left her high school romance with Brian Winchester in the past. Denise and Brian were carrying on a secret affair that started in 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance. They rekindled their relationship after a double date to a concert, sneaking a kiss in while their spouses, Mike and Kathy, were just away for a second to park the car. From that night on, according to Brian's later testimony, the affair just snowballed into a full-blown relationship. They met in secret whenever Mike was away at work, even finding ways to sneak alone time during group trips together. Brian would tag along on Mike's business trips, only to steal private moments away with his wife, Denise. In a twisted turn, Kathy, Brian's wife, actually later revealed shortly before Mike went missing that she, Brian, and Denise had engaged in a bizarre sexual encounter together. It seems Denise and Brian were really testing boundaries to try to deepen their connection, all while Mike, and Mike alone, remained completely in the dark about it. Something I can't help but wonder is, why didn't Denise just leave Mike if she wanted to be with Brian? The answer to this speaks volumes about her mindset and would become central to the end of this case. Denise Williams absolutely refused to consider divorce with her husband. In Brian's own words, divorce was against her religious beliefs, and she, quote, was not willing to endure the public shame of a divorce, unquote. Denise also didn't want to risk a messy custody battle over Ansley or to lose the comfortable lifestyle that her and Mike had built together. Instead, Brian later confessed that, quote, she basically said there's only one solution, end quote. To Denise, the only acceptable way to get rid of her husband was if he died, and if it could be made to look like a tragic accident, it would leave her as a young widow rather than a divorcee. This chilling mindset laid the groundwork for the murderous plot that was about to unfold. Brian Winchester testified that they actively discussed murdering their spouses so that they could be together. At one point, Denise even suggested a plan to stage a boating accident in Mexico during a couple's trip and, quote, throw both Mike and Kathy overboard, end quote, to drown, eliminating both of their spouses at the same time. Brian admitted that he wasn't a fan of that idea because he didn't want to kill the mother of his children, Kathy, but his best friend was fine to kill. Insane. Instead of shutting this down completely, though, they brainstormed other ideas together. Denise, still against divorce, continued to say that something permanent needed to be done about Mike. Brian eventually landed on a plan that seemed diabolically clever: make Mike's death look like a hunting accident. Sometime earlier, Mike and Brian had actually gone duck hunting in Arkansas when Mike got stuck in the mud and Brian rescued him. This incident sparked Brian's imagination. He realized that a hunting trip could be the perfect cover-up. If Mike died in a tragic accident, who would have suspected foul play? He was an experienced outdoorsman, but accidents still happen to even the best. The wilderness could even help hide some of the evidence, and with Mike gone, Denise could actually collect that life insurance payout, which Brian, as the agent, knew exactly how much was at stake, and they could finally be together out in the open. Saturday, December 16th, 2000, was a cold and clear day in Tallahassee. It was still dark outside when Mike Williams loaded up his Bronco for that morning duck hunt. He hitched his boat to the truck and left his home on Centennial Oak Circle shortly before dawn and told Denise that he'd be back around noon so that they could celebrate their anniversary together that night. Mike drove about 50 miles west to Lake Seminole, which is a massive reservoir on the Florida-Georgia line known for its duck hunting. With its 37,500 acres of water, Lake Seminole can be dangerous to navigate. Locals know that one area in particular, called the Stump Field, is a very dangerous spot where submerged trees lurk beneath the water's surface. Hunters have to be cautious piloting their boats through there, especially in those dark early morning hours. Around 7 a.m., Mike met up with his best friend Brian at the lake. Mike had no idea that this outing would be different from countless others that they'd enjoyed together. According to Brian's later confession, the two launched their boat and set across the cove to the Stump Field area. Brian had packed his 12-gauge shotgun as well because, after all, it was a hunting trip. He had a very specific plan for this day. At some point on the water, Brian suggested that they head to a particular, quote, special secret spot, end quote, for ducks, leading Mike into a position near some partially submerged stumps. As Mike would stand up, perhaps to move or maybe look to see where Brian was pointing, Brian would seize that moment. Without warning, Brian shoved Mike overboard into the murky lake. The water was frigid and around 58 degrees Fahrenheit that day, with even colder temperatures expected that weekend. Mike, who was wearing waterproof hunting pants with attached boots and a hunting jacket, plunged into the lake. Brian's expectation was that the water-filled waders would drag Mike down quickly, causing him to drown. This kind of accident, where a hunter falls overboard and his waders become kind of waterlogged and acts as like a dangerous anchor, is exactly what authorities would later assume happened. For a few moments, Mike thrashed in the cold water, but he didn't immediately sink. Mike was a strong swimmer and a seasoned hunter, so he managed to keep his head above water and grabbed onto a tree stump protruding from the lake. Imagine Brian's panic in that moment. His perfect accident was not going according to plan. Even worse, imagine the thoughts that Mike was having. He probably thought that this was some kind of sick joke. then quickly realized that his very best friend was betraying him, and I can't even imagine how heartbreaking that must have been. Desperate to finish what he had started, Brian Winchester grabbed his shotgun. As Mike clung to the stump, pleading for help, Brian raised the 12 gauge and fired it directly at Mike's head from point blank range. The blast hit Mike directly in the face, killing him instantly. Brian Winchester had just murdered his very best friend, and now he needed to make it look like an accident and cover his tracks. The early morning hours and remote location meant that there were no witnesses around the cove to be able to testify to the events that day. Brian hauled Mike's lifeless body out of the water and into his boat, then drove the boat back to shore. He transferred Mike's body into the bed of his truck and concealed it under a tarp for the drive back to Tallahassee. But first, he needed to stage the scene at Lake Seminole. Working quickly, Brian pushed Mike's boat back out onto the lake, letting it drift freely, and left Mike's Bronco and boat trailer abandoned at the stump field area. This way, responders would find Mike's vehicle and empty boat and assume that he must have drowned. With chilling composure, Brian Winchester then went about his day acting completely normal. He had a busy afternoon ahead, starting with a family friend gathering at his wife Kathy's birthday party and a Christmas party later that night. After hiding Mike's body, Brian went straight into a family function as if nothing happened, all while knowing that a search for Mike would soon be underway. At that family Christmas party, Brian learned from others that Mike was missing and joined in on the shock and concern that everyone else was feeling at that time. This was the beginning of 17 years of lies. Back at home, around midday, Denise Williams was growing concerned. Noon had come and went, and Mike hadn't returned any of her calls. Denise began phoning around to see if anyone had heard from Mike, and one of the people that she actually called was Kathy Thomas, Brian's wife. In that call, Denise sounded panicked and asked Kathy if she knew where Brian or Mike were, saying that Mike had never come home that day. Denise's behavior seemed off, though, because some wondered if it was a genuine reaction or perhaps a calculated move to create an alibi right away. Regardless, by early afternoon, word reached Mike's family that something was wrong. Denise called her father and also let Brian Winchester know about Mike's absence, though Brian, of course, already knew exactly where Mike was. Brian and his own father, Marcus Winchester, sprang into action and drove out to Lake Seminole to look for any sign of Mike. It was Brian and his dad who actually discovered Mike's Bronco parked near an underdeveloped dirt road launch by the lake, with Mike's boat and trailer still attached. This was around the area that Brian had staged it, known as Carjack Cove, on the Jackson County side of the lake. Not far offshore, they spotted an empty drifting boat that also belonged to Mike. The boat was bobbing at around 225 feet from the launch, and a helicopter search team actually spotted it from the air and directed ground searchers directly to it as well. Inside the boat, searchers found Mike's shotgun still in its case, along with a few floating duck decoys, but no sign of Mike. It was as if Mike had literally vanished into thin air. By Saturday afternoon, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway at Lake Seminole. Denise Williams waited anxiously at home or by the phone for updates while Brian appeared visibly upset as he joined law enforcement in combing the lakeshore. Neighbors and friends showed up to help, all hoping that Mike had perhaps gotten lost in the swamp or was clinging to a log somewhere just waiting rescue. At this point, though, does anyone else feel like it's odd that Denise wasn't out trying to search for her husband? I know that we're biased because we already know how this story ends, but I would like to think that this would be a red flag to me that she wasn't there looking. All right, back to the story. Despite the intense search efforts, nature interfered. That very night, a winter storm rolled through the area. Wind and rain hit them really, really hard, forcing searchers to halt the search due to dangerous weather conditions. The storm produced strong winds, which, interestingly, should have pushed any boat across the Georgia side of the lake. Yet Mike's boat had been found near where he had launched it, and this later struck investigators as really odd. But in the moment, everyone's focus was on finding Mike when the weather had cleared. For Cheryl Williams, who had always been close to her sons, the news that Mike had been missing was absolutely devastating. She rushed to the scene and watched with dread as day turned into night with no word from her son. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare mystery that would completely consume her life. Over the next 44 days, an intensive search effort on and around Lake Seminole struggled to find any trace of Mike Williams. The operation was initially treated as a search and rescue mission since it was reported as a missing hunter case. Jackson County Sheriff's deputies and dozens of volunteers assisted as well. Searchers scoured roughly 10 acres of the swampy cove where Mike's boat had been initially found. They used boats, helicopters, and divers, often having to navigate the hazardous tree stumps lurking in the water. The water in that area was 8 to 12 feet deep. One theory was that Mike might have hit a stump with his boat, been jolted overboard, and then drowned in his waders after they had filled with water, pulling him under. Typically, a drowning victim's body would resurface within 3 to 7 days as gases from decomposition kind of build up and make the body buoyant. But days passed and no body floated up in the cove. Investigators initially assured the Williams family that Mike's body would likely surface once the lake gave him up, even accounting for the unusually cold weather that week. When nothing came up after over a week, whispers of other possibilities began. Could Mike have intentionally disappeared? Did he run off to start a new life? One FWC officer, lacking any evidence of this accident, even speculated that maybe he just abandoned his family, though those who knew Mike found that suggestion completely absurd. Mike adored Denise and was absolutely in love with his 18-month-old daughter. He never would have abandoned any of them on his own free will. 10 days into the search, on December 26, 2000, there was a brief flutter of hope, or perhaps fear, when searchers found a camouflage hat that was floating in the lake. Family members thought that it might be Mike's hat. However, it couldn't be conclusively linked to him. Denise did not recall what Mike was even wearing that morning, and the hat had no identifying marks to tie them back to him. The search dragged on into January, oftentimes interrupted by the weather, wind, and the terrain. Rescuers also mentioned an unusually high number of alligators in the area as the weather briefly warmed, which unsettled everyone, given the thought that alligators might have gotten to Mike. This was something that crossed my mind as well when I was researching this case. When I found out that there were alligators at the lake, this theory made a lot of sense to me too. By early February 2001, after weeks of efforts, officials called off the official search. Mike's brothers, friends, and volunteers had combed every accessible part of that lake and swamp without any success. The FWC's final report said that nothing was found to produce any definitive evidence of a boat accident or fatality. In other words, they had no proof that Mike was even in the lake, let alone dead. Still, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, the working theory remained that Mike had drowned and his body simply hadn't been recovered yet. The case remained open as a missing persons report, but with no new leads, active efforts would die down. 6 months later, in June 2001, a discovery seemed to both confirm and complicate the drowning theory. A fisherman in the Stump Field area of Lake Seminole spotted something unusual: a pair of waders, those waterproof pants, floating upright in the water. They appeared to be in really good condition and not anchored to anything. Divers were called back to that area, and in that same vicinity, they recovered several more of Mike's belongings from the lake bottom, including a lightweight camouflage hunting jacket and a flashlight. In a pocket of the jacket was Mike's hunting license, still intact, with his name and signature on it. To many, this was the proof that they had been searching for all this time. The logic was, if Mike's waders and jacket were found in the lake, then Mike had to have drowned there, and perhaps his body had been consumed by alligators or other swamp predators. The alligator theory took on its own new life, though. One of the search team leaders wrote in a report that, quote, "With the wildlife around, I would guess that the alligators may have dismembered and stored his remains in a location that we would not be able to access," end quote. Local wildlife officers stated that Lake Seminole was full of gators, and that it wasn't unheard of for gators to stash their prey underwater logs to feed on later. The idea was morbid but possible to those not looking close enough. If alligators had taken Mike, that could explain why searchers never found a body. Some pointed to turtles and catfish because they may have also been able to scavenge those remains, potentially leaving nothing behind to be discovered. Denise Williams, who had avoided media attention throughout the entire ordeal, accepted this explanation. In fact, Denise moved quickly to settle matters. Just 1 week after the waders and jacket had surfaced, and only 6 months after Mike disappeared, Denise petitioned the court to declare her husband legally dead. Florida law usually requires a waiting period of 5 years with no body before a missing persons case can be declared deceased by a court. But Denise's attorney argued that the recovered items, combined with the likelihood of gators, constituted sufficient evidence of death. In a highly unusual move, a Leon County judge agreed. In February of 2001, Mike Williams was officially declared dead, and the cause of death was, quote, "accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. Body has not yet been recovered," end quote. With that court order, Denise was able to claim Mike's insurance policy payout immediately. She received about $1.5 to $1.75 million between the 3 policies, which is a massive amount of money for a young widow. Remember, one of those policies was that $1 million policy that Brian Winchester had sold Mike just months before. Friends like Clay Ketchum, Mike's boss, later stated that Denise had been under some financial strain after her husband disappeared, and she even sold off some of Mike's belongings to make ends meet while awaiting that insurance money payout. Once the funds came through, however, Denise was financially secure. The tragic saga of Mike Williams was now closed. A memorial service was held for Mike on February 11, 2001, at the very same church where he and Denise had been married. The community mourned a beloved son, friend, and father who had been lost to a freak accident. Almost everyone seemed ready to move on. Everyone except for Mike's mother, Cheryl. Cheryl Williams could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the official story of her son's disappearance. A mother's intuition is always on point, and I think that we've seen that in several other cases that we've recently discussed as well. From day one, Cheryl refused to believe that Mike drowned in Lake Seminole. She knew her son was a strong swimmer and was very careful while hunting. To her, the circumstances just didn't add up. After the initial search was called off, Cheryl's concern only grew. Why hadn't a body been found? Why did Denise seem so quick to accept Mike's death and so eager to get a death certificate? Cheryl's maternal instincts screamed that her son Mike had not simply drowned. In the months following Mike's disappearance, as others moved on, Cheryl quietly began her own investigation. She kept meticulous notes on every odd detail, every rumor, and every inconsistency. Eventually, she had compiled 27 single-spaced pages of notes filled with unanswered questions and observations. Some of the questions that she wrote down were really practical. What made the waiters float up after 6 months underwater? Why were the items in such good shape? Other notes were more emotional, like, please help me find my son, hoping anyone would listen. She also noted something alarming. Alligators do not typically feed in cold winter months. Wildlife experts did confirm to Cheryl that when water temperatures drop, alligators enter a semi-dormant state and eat far less or not at all. The day that Mike went missing, the air temperature was about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and overnight lows had dipped below freezing. By the next day, the lake water was down to 46 degrees with a thin layer of ice near shore. So would alligators have been eating or not? In Cheryl's mind, alligators probably did not eat Mike. So where was he? Cheryl's relentless pursuit of the truth put her at odds with her former daughter-in-law. Denise had cut off nearly all contact with Cheryl, even threatening to never let her see Ansley, her granddaughter, if Cheryl didn't stop pushing to investigate Mike's disappearance. This only deepened Cheryl's suspicions. Why would Denise be so adamant against further investigation unless she feared what might be found? Despite the pain of being cut off from Ansley, Cheryl persisted. She felt it was her duty as a mother to keep Mike's story alive until she found concrete evidence. Over the next several years, Cheryl Williams became a familiar sight all around Tallahassee. She stood on street corners with signs asking for more information about Mike. She took out classified ads in the Tallahassee Democrat newspaper, begging everyone for clues. She put up billboards around the area with Mike's face and a tip number line. These are not the gestures of a mother simply doing this out of heartbreak. Her heart knew that this was all wrong. In one TV interview, a grieving Cheryl looked directly in the camera and said, quote, "He may be dead, but he's not in that lake. And if somebody did hurt my child, I want him found and I want him punished," end quote. Many dismissed her as a mother in denial, unable to accept the tragedy. Even close friends admit that they thought, quote, "This is so sad that Cheryl can't accept Mike in all likelihood drowned, but this is her child. She's gonna hold out for hope," end quote. Cheryl responded to critics by simply saying, "I can't stop looking for him until I find him." What Cheryl lacked in official support, she made up for in persistence. She wrote a letter to Florida's then Governor Jeb Bush every single day for 9 years, which was 1,472 letters pleading to please reopen Mike's case. The squeaky wheel approach did work. By 2004, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, agreed to take another look at this case. Normally, the FDLE does not get involved in missing person cases at a citizen's request, but Cheryl's persistence really persuaded them that Mike's disappearance really needed a closer look. In Cheryl's view, this was progress, but she also claimed that during these years, she received threatening messages telling her to stop digging, indicating that someone out there was really nervous about what she could find. As 2004 arrived, nearly 4 years since Mike had vanished, a small glimmer of hope emerged that the truth could still surface. Investigators were about to take a fresh look and had new questions for a case that many had written off. Cheryl Williams' intuition and refusal to let her son be forgotten was finally getting results. Little did she know, it would still be many, many years and shocking twists later before she got the full truth. But crucial groundwork was about to be laid in these early investigations that will help later crack the case. When FDLE agents reopened the Mike Williams case in 2004, they did it quietly. For the first time, authorities approached it not as a tragic accident, but as a potential crime. In retrospect, many officials admitted that the original investigation had overlooked quite a few red flags. Now, with Cheryl's pleas, investigators started scrutinizing details that had been previously glossed over. Almost immediately, they found aspects of the supposed drowning scenario that didn't make any sense. For starters, Mike's Bronco and boat trailer were found at a rough, muddy slope launch in a remote part of the lake, but nearby, there were concrete ramps that Mike always was known to use. Why would an experienced hunter like Mike choose a launch site that he never used before, especially in those early morning dark hours? Investigators found this really odd. Perhaps the Bronco had been parked there by someone else, maybe, that was familiar with his routine. Additionally, that violent storm on the night of Mike's disappearance had winds strong enough that a boat should have been blown clear across the Georgia lakeside. Yet Mike's boat was found not far from where he presumably fell out. One boat manufacturer's representative, when told about the scenario, said, quote, "Something sounds fishy. If the engine had been running when he fell out, the boat should have kept going until it ran out of gas," unquote. But Mike's boat engine was off and its gas tank was completely full when recovered, suggesting that it hadn't been running for long or at all after Mike had went missing. Investigators also learned that Mike usually never hunted alone. He was social and very safety conscious, typically going on hunting trips with multiple friends. The idea that Mike just decided to go on a solo duck hunting trip on his anniversary morning struck everyone that knew him as odd. One officer said, quote, "Some things look unusual right off the bat. Then after a couple, 3 days, after all those weeks went on, those things looked even more out of place," unquote. In other words, the whole setup at the lake seemed staged. One of the biggest breakthroughs in 2004, though, was a scientific reality check on the alligator theory. As Cheryl had already discovered, alligators are dormant in the wintertime. The FDLE consulted Matt Oresco, who's a local herpetologist, who confirmed that in cold temperatures, quote, "It's highly unlikely that an alligator would have been active. 58 degrees is too cold for an alligator to be interested in food at all," end quote. Alligators during the winter mostly just maintain a body temperature and do not hunt. If by some chance alligators did get a hold of a 170-pound man, Mike, they would have left something like bones or clothing shreds behind. As one investigator put it, attributing the complete disappearance of a grown man entirely to gators and other aquatic animals really stretches credibility. This expert opinion shattered the main theory of the accidental death. If alligators had not eaten Mike, where was his body? Suddenly, the investigators were convinced Mike Williams likely did not die at Lake Seminole after all. They now considered it a suspicious missing persons case at the very least. They re-examined the evidence found in the lake, the waders, the jacket, the license, the flashlight, and everything recovered in June of 2001. These items had conveniently appeared after official searches had ended and right before the expedited death declaration. Investigators grew suspicious that these items might have been planted to support the drowning story, though. Several facts stood out. The waders had no tears or bite marks, and when an officer filtered the water from inside of them, he found no human remains or any evidence of prolonged water submersion. If Mike had drowned and had been chewed up by alligators wearing those waders, you'd expect some damage or residue, and there was none. The hunting jacket and flashlight also were in far better condition than 6 months in the elements should suggest, and the flashlight even still turned on when tested. Perhaps the most revealing detail was that Mike's friend said Mike never wore his waders while driving the boat. Mike was extremely safe. He had a practice of only putting on his heavy waders after reaching his hunting spot, specifically to avoid the scenario of falling overboard and being weighed down. He said, quote, "As much as he preached that to me, why would he be wearing his waders while driving the boat," end quote. For investigators, this suggested that the waders found in the lake might not have been worn by Mike at all. They could have been tossed into the lake later to create a false trail to cover up his murder. All signs pointed to the conclusion that Mike's death had been staged as a boating accident. However, proving a crime is far harder, especially years after the fact. The FDLE team realized the original search had not preserved the scene as a potential crime scene at all, because back in 2000, it wasn't treated as one. By 2004, crucial items like Mike's boat and Bronco had long been returned to the family, the shoreline had been trampled by searchers, and those found waders and jacket had not been kept as evidence. Investigators were basically starting from scratch, with suspicions but scant physical evidence on hand. As one FDLE officer later put it, quote, "We're at a brick wall, pounding our heads against it," end quote. They had persons of interest in mind, and Denise Williams and Brian Winchester were on their radar, but they didn't have anything to arrest them. No body, no crime was a massive hurdle. By 2006, after 2 years of digging, the FDLE had to scale back the active investigation. They formally closed the case once again, admitting that without any new leads or evidence, they couldn't proceed. Cheryl's relentless calls to the FDLE became an annoyance to them. Cold case agents eventually stopped returning her calls. It was a frustrating setback, but Cheryl did not give up. She continued advertising in the paper and telling anyone who would listen that her son had clearly been murdered. In October 2007, Mike's older brother found a piece of information that sparked interest once again. He came across an old picture of their late father's .22 caliber along with its original serial number. This jogged a memory. When Mike was declared dead, he had inherited that pistol from their dad, and it was the only firearm of Mike's that Denise did not return to the family. Every other gun that Mike had owned had been given back, but not that one. Why? Investigators thought that if they could locate that gun, it could lead somewhere. Acting on that lead, FDLE's Derek Wester contacted the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or the ATF, to trace the gun. It wasn't easy after many, many years, but they did discover that Denise, now Denise Winchester, more to come on that soon, still had it. Agents went to interview Denise and Brian at their home, which was the very same house on Centennial Oak Circle where Denise had lived with Mike. Shortly after the agent's visit, an attorney for the Winchesters turned the missing handgun over to the FDLE. The gun was sent to a forensic lab for DNA testing, but unfortunately, the results were never made public. However, that same autumn of 2007, rumors swirled that a grand jury was hearing evidence in Mike's case and might be issuing indictments. Nothing concrete came from it at that time, but law enforcement pressure was quietly building around the case. Perhaps those under suspicion may have felt the heat, which explains what happens here shortly. Insurance fraud was another avenue that investigators were pursuing at the time. In 2008, Florida's Department of Financial Services opened up an inquiry into whether or not any fraud had occurred in that life insurance payout for Mike Williams. Normally, the statute of limitations for insurance fraud is 5 years, which would have expired in 2005, but under certain circumstances, it could be extended to 8 years, which was exactly enough time to look into this 2001 payout in 2008. Investigators noted suspicious details. Denise's petition to declare Mike dead had only listed the policies that Brian Winchester sold them from Kansas City Life, omitting mention of other smaller policies that Mike had already had. This could indicate an attempt not to draw attention or suspicion to her. Also, the notion that no body was found might not sit well with insurance companies if foul play is suspected. However, an insurance law expert pointed out that without proof of a crime or that Mike was alive, there wasn't a strong fraud case. Simply having a missing body does not equal insurance fraud. You would need evidence that the beneficiary, Denise, was involved in some wrongdoing or that Mike wasn't really dead. After some months, the insurance fraud investigation hit the same wall. Lots of suspicion, but not enough evidence. It was closed with officials saying, quote, "We have suspicions, but we need more evidence," end quote, and that they would reopen it if new information, once again, came to light. At the end of 2008, 8 years after Mike had vanished, 3 separate investigations, the initial search, the FDLE, and the insurance inquiry, had all died off without any arrests or any answers. It was a really bitter pill for Cheryl Williams to swallow. She had moved mountains to get this far, only to see the case stall once again. Still, she didn't quit. She continued writing letters and even convinced the Investigation Discovery Channel to cover Mike's story. In late 2011, an episode of Disappeared profiled Mike's case, hopefully to draw out some new tips. Cheryl said in that program, quote, "We don't know what the smoking gun is, but we hope someone will find it," end quote. She was not giving up, and neither was law enforcement entirely. Quietly, Mike's case was still open in the background, just waiting for a break. What none of them knew was that this, quote, "smoking gun" would not be a literal gun or piece of evidence, but rather the guilty conscience of one of the conspirators forced into a corner. The break would come from within the twisted triangle of Mike, Denise, and Brian, and it would take more than a decade and the collapse of a marriage to trigger it. Before we move into the dramatic breakthrough, though, it's really important to fully understand what had been happening behind the scenes with Denise and Brian. While Cheryl and investigators were hunting for clues, Denise and Brian Winchester were carrying on with their lives together in an unapologetic fashion that in hindsight raised a lot of eyebrows. In 2001, only 5 months after Mike was declared dead and Denise collected the insurance money, Brian Winchester divorced his wife, Kathy. The timing was really hard to ignore. Brian's marriage fell apart soon after Mike was out of the picture, and Kathy later testified that she had long suspected Brian and Denise were romantically involved even before Mike went missing. Now her suspicions were confirmed by his quick moves. Meanwhile, Denise, newly widowed at 31, was publicly playing the role of a grieving wife. But she didn't stay single forever. In 2005, Denise Williams and Brian Winchester married each other. They kept their affair secret for years, and now they could be together openly and get married. Brian moved into the same house on Centennial Oak Circle that Denise had shared with Mike, essentially stepping into Mike's life in every way. I find that so disturbing. To friends and family who hadn't suspected foul play, it might have seemed like two people who shared a common loss somehow found solace together. However, to many, many others, this was a massive red flag. Mike's mother, Cheryl, was outraged and even more convinced than ever of their guilt. One friend said, quote, "You can see where this is heading now," unquote. The widow and the best friend marrying each other, and the fact that Brian had also been their insurance agent looked really suspicious, almost textbook conspiracy. In their own statements, Brian and Denise insisted that they simply fell in love through mutual grief. But later evidence revealed the truth. They had been in love, or at least in lust, long before Mike's accident. During Denise's trial, Brian finally testified under oath about the full extent of their affair. He admitted that they had begun sleeping together in 1997, carried on the affair right under Mike's and Kathy's noses, and said that it just snowballed from a fling into a serious, years-long relationship. They plotted Mike's murder so that they could be together and also collect the life insurance for a financial head start. Brian testified that after Mike was gone, he and Denise wanted to take it slow. They didn't marry immediately in order to avoid looking suspicious and also let the insurance money gain interest. They finally wed about 5 years later, perhaps thinking that by then any suspicion had blown over. For a while, Brian and Denise had their own dark version of happily ever after. They were a wealthy couple because Denise had the insurance money and Brian had a good job, and they were also raising Ansley, Mike's and Denise's daughter, as their own child. Ansley was being raised by the two people that were responsible for her father's death. Denise cut off contact between Ansley and the Williams side of the family, so Ansley grew up not knowing her grandmother Cheryl or ever even hearing her father's side of the story at all. As far as Ansley was aware, Brian Winchester was a stepfather who loved her, and her father Mike had tragically drowned when she was just a baby. But the seemingly perfect crime partnership did not remain perfect. Over the years, the relationship between Denise and Brian began to go south. According to Brian, quote, "We had an agreement that she would never say anything about me and I would never say anything about her because we felt like as long as neither of us talked, nobody would ever find out what happened," end quote. This was a pact of silence. They had truly gotten away with murder for many, many years, yet living with that secret was not easy. Both of them reportedly became paranoid, constantly afraid that law enforcement was watching or that someone would talk. Their marriage was also strained by Brian's personal issues. According to later accounts, Brian actually had a sex addiction and other behaviors that really troubled Denise and caused countless problems in their marriage. By 2012, so just 7 years into their marriage, the couple had grown apart and separated. Trust between them was eroding, and they no longer shared a bed, and Denise actually began to withdraw at that time. In 2015, Denise filed for divorce from Brian. With trust broken, could they keep this dark secret? This put both co-conspirators on edge. Their pact only worked as long as they were loyal to each other and together. A divorce raised that terrifying thought that one of them may betray the other, perhaps as leverage or out of spite. Brian Winchester became desperate to keep Denise from leaving him permanently. He knew that once they divorced, Denise might feel like she had nothing to lose by going to the police first, though in reality, Denise seemed intent on keeping this quiet to protect herself. Brian was spiraling. He couldn't bear the thought of not only losing Denise, but he also feared that she might implicate him in Mike's murder if they had this ugly breakup. In his mind, Denise was the only person who could destroy the life that he knew, either by taking away their family or by talking to authorities. This toxic mix of fear and obsession led Brian to a really reckless act, one that would ironically become the beginning of the end of their secret. On the morning of August 5th, 2016, Tallahassee authorities received a very concerning 911 call from Denise. She reported that her estranged husband Brian had kidnapped her at gunpoint in a terrifying encounter. The details of this incident were almost unbelievable, the sort of scenario that makes no sense unless you actually know the dark secret that they're keeping. That day, Denise left her home for work as usual. She got into her SUV and started driving. Unbeknownst to her, Brian was lying in the back in wait. He had snuck into the back of that SUV and hidden himself there with a carpet and a sheet. When Denise was partway through her drive, Brian suddenly popped up from the back seat with a handgun in his hand. Denise was shocked and terrified. Brian pointed the gun at her and he told her to keep driving, and he intended to confront her in private. According to Denise's later statements, Brian was extremely agitated and said that he planned to take himself out and make sure that she would listen to him first. It appears Brian's plan was possibly to kill them both or at least scare Denise into calling off the divorce. He told her that he couldn't live without her, and then he took her cell phone to prevent her from calling for help. This tense standoff in the vehicle continued for some time as Denise continued to drive. She later recounted that she was able to talk Brian down. She promised that she wouldn't tell the police about this if he let her go. Remarkably and fortunately, Brian eventually relented. He allowed Denise to pull over into a parking lot where this confrontation ended without any physical harm. Denise immediately fled and called the police the second that she felt safe, reporting that Brian had threatened her with a gun and essentially attempted to abduct her. Brian Winchester was quickly arrested for this incident. He was charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and armed burglary for sneaking into her car. The news that Brian Winchester had tried to kidnap Denise was huge in Tallahassee. Remember, these two were known publicly as the tragic widow and the best friend who married, having bonded over Mike's tragic death. Now, one was in jail for threatening the other. To those who had suspicions about Mike's case to begin with, this event was really odd. Something was very wrong in the Winchester household, and perhaps that dark secret was closer to coming out now. This bizarre crime was exactly the break that investigators were hoping for. Here was Brian Winchester, a longtime person of interest in Mike Williams' disappearance, now jailed for a serious felony against Denise. If there was ever a time to push one of them to talk about Mike, it was now. Investigators from the FDLE, who always had a lingering eye on the Williams case, hoped that either Brian or Denise, feeling pressure from this new turn of events, might finally crack. They started with Denise. After the kidnapping, Denise understandably wanted Brian put away. However, when investigators tried to question Denise about Mike's 2000 disappearance, she absolutely refused to cooperate. She didn't want to discuss anything beyond the immediate crime against her at hand. Denise hired a lawyer, and aside from detailing the kidnapping, she would not speak about Mike. This was telling. An innocent person, as some thought, and honestly I do too, would welcome the chance to solve her late husband's mystery now that she believed Brian was dangerous. But Denise wouldn't offer any additional information. Brian Winchester, sitting in jail and facing serious prison time for the armed kidnapping, had a lot more to lose. He realized that the leverage that he and Denise held over each other was now gone. Their alliance had been broken. The trust was shattered when Denise turned him in. Brian may also have realized that with their marriage effectively over, Denise had incentive to pin everything on him if authorities ever reopened the case. Brian had to make a move to save himself. And so, in late 2017, Brian Winchester made a decision. He agreed to confess everything that he knew about Mike Williams' fate in exchange for a deal with the prosecutors. The deal was this: Brian would tell the full truth about the murder and lead investigators to Mike's body, and in return, the state would not charge him with murder. Essentially, immunity for the murder was granted as long as his information all checked out. The logic was that they already had Brian on the kidnapping, which would put him away for a very long time anyway, but they still had no body and no direct evidence in Mike's case. Brian's testimony was the key to finally solving it and getting at least one conspirator, Denise, for the murder. In December 2017, just before Brian's sentencing on the kidnapping charge, he sat down with the FDLE and confessed in detail to murdering Mike Williams. He also led them to the place where he had hidden Mike's remains 17 years prior. The authorities kept this development tightly under wraps at first. They wanted to verify everything and gather as much evidence as possible before making any public moves, especially since now they were aiming to prosecute Denise for her role in this. Following Brian Winchester's confession, FDLE agents finally knew where to find Mike's body. It was not in Lake Seminole after all, but rather at the end of a lonely, dead-end dirt road near Carr Lake in northern Leon County, Florida, only about 5 miles from where Mike grew up. In the frantic aftermath of the shooting on Lake Seminole back in 2000, Brian had driven Mike's body to this remote spot and hastily buried him there. The area was wild and swampy and a place that hunters and fishermen occasionally passed, but rarely ever stopped to examine it closely. For 17 years, Mike's grave laid undisturbed. With Brian's directions, the FDLE coordinated a secret recovery operation in early October 2017. They were careful not to tip anyone off, especially Denise, that Mike's remains might be found. Under the guise of a training exercise, they brought in heavy equipment and forensic teams over to that site. Over the next several days, Leon County employees and FDLE personnel worked through the tough conditions to excavate the area. They were using backhoes to dig 9-foot deep holes, systematically turning over mud and soil. This work was grueling. They had to constantly pump out water to keep those holes from flooding and work around the local wildlife, including many venomous snakes. They worked for 5 days, hoping to find what Brian had promised to find there. Finally, on October 18th, human remains were discovered. Search dogs alerted to the piles of dirt that had been excavated and spread on plywood sheets, and there it was, the skeletal remains of a man. Over the next hours, investigators carefully recovered and cataloged all the evidence. Astonishingly, they found approximately 98% of Mike Williams' bones, which was an almost complete skeleton, and they were very well preserved despite 17 years in a muddy grave. The anaerobic or oxygen-poor conditions of the swamp likely helped slow decomposition, which effectively mummified parts of the remains in the mud. Among the items retrieved were bits of clothing that Mike had worn, including winter gloves and socks that were still intact and attached to the remains. They also found Mike's wedding band still on his finger, which was a shocking and powerful clue connecting the body to the missing man. 2 separate DNA tests were performed, comparing the remains of the sample of Cheryl Williams' DNA. Both tests came back positive, confirming that the remains indeed belonged to Jerry Michael Williams. After 17 years of limbo, Mike's family finally had him back, or what was left of him. Cheryl Williams later said that this discovery was, quote, by the grace of God, end quote, and she had prayed for so long to find her son. Perhaps most crucially for the criminal case, the bones themselves told a story of murder. The forensic examination found clear evidence that Mike Williams had been shot in the head at close range. In fact, investigators recovered shotgun pellets in Mike's skull during the autopsy and took X-ray images that also confirmed that. The medical examiner could see that the pellets were concentrated in his head, consistent with a shotgun blast to the face from only a few feet away. This matched exactly with what Brian Winchester's confession was. He had told them that he shot Mike in the head with a 12-gauge shotgun after pushing him overboard. With Mike's body found and the manner of death confirmed, the FDLE made a public announcement on December 13, 2017. They revealed that the remains of Mike Williams had been located and that the case was now officially considered a homicide. They did not release details such as how he was killed or who was suspected, saying that only the perpetrators would know those details and they were withholding them to preserve the integrity of the investigation. After years of rumors and mystery, it was finally confirmed. Mike Williams was murdered. Brian Winchester was already in prison after being sentenced to 20 years in 2017 for the kidnapping of Denise, with 502 days credited for time served. The only other person intimately tied to both Mike and Brian was Denise Williams. Investigators had been carefully building a case against Denise in those weeks since finding the body. They had Brian's full confession implicating her, physical evidence from Mike's remains, and other pieces like recorded conversations that pointed directly to her involvement. In the spring of 2018, a Leon County grand jury was convened. It didn't take long for them at all to decide that there was enough evidence to charge Denise. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was arrested. She was actually on her way to celebrate her daughter Ansley's 19th birthday when police took her into custody. A grand jury had indicted Denise on 3 counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. The accessory charge specifically alleged that sometime between August 2014 and Brian's sentencing in 2017, Denise had helped Brian avoid arrest or detection for the murder, likely referring to her years of silence and perhaps efforts to throw off the investigation. Denise Williams, then 48 years old, professed her innocence as she was booked into jail. Her attorney, Ethan Way, told the media that Denise, quote, had absolutely nothing to do with Mike Williams' disappearance and absolutely nothing to do with any crimes that Brian Winchester has committed, end quote. He entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf. Meanwhile, Mike's mother, Cheryl, finally received the visit that she had waited nearly 2 decades for. FDLE agents came to her door and informed her of the indictment. I can only imagine how she felt after spending so many years advocating and fighting for her son. Following her arrest, Denise Williams was denied bail, which is unsurprising given the gravity of the charges and the prosecutor's argument that she might be a flight risk or a danger if released. The judge ordered her held in jail as she awaited trial, which took place in December 2018. In the lead up to the trial, some key evidence emerged. Prosecutors had audio of Brian Winchester's confession to the FDLE in which he admitted shooting Mike and claimed the murder was Denise's idea. Denise's defense attorneys fought to exclude this tape, arguing that since Brian wasn't being charged for murder due to his immunity deal and wasn't on trial, his out-of-court confession should not be used against Denise. Let me know your thoughts on this. The judge, however, allowed it, reasoning that Brian was simply telling the truth about what happened. And since Brian would also be taking the stand, the jury could hear it from him directly anyway. The trial began on December 10th, 2018 in Tallahassee. The prosecution's case painted Denise Williams as a cold, calculating woman who conspired to murder her husband for money and to avoid the stigma of divorce. In his opening statement, the assistant state attorney said, quote, "Denise likes the sound of being a widow much more than being a divorcee. Obviously, you can't be caught with a murder, so they had to make it look like an accident," end quote. The state argued that Denise and Brian planned the accident and benefited from it, living a life of freedom and wealth until the relationship fell apart. The star witness of the prosecution was, of course, Brian Winchester. Shackled and brought in from prison where he was serving his kidnapping sentence, Brian took the stand and over multiple days laid out the entire story. He had nothing to lose by telling the truth now. In fact, it was actually part of his agreement, so he had to. Brian recounted how he and Denise had never truly ended their romance even as they married their spouses. He described the secret affair in the late 90s, how they found moments to be together and sneak around, and even that first kiss at the Sister Hazel concert in 1997 while Mike and Kathy were parking the car. He admitted that they snuck around whenever possible and that Kathy had correctly suspected them back then. Brian's testimony revealed the depths of their connection when at one point, Denise and Kathy had that threesome not long before Mike's death, which was evidence of how twisted the situation had become. Brian further testified that he and Denise actively planned Mike's murder together. He corroborated what he had told the FDLE in his confession. According to Brian, Denise was the one who pushed the idea that murder was the only solution because she refused to divorce her husband. They dismissed one plan, killing both Mike and Kathy on that boat trip, and settled on the Lake Seminole hunting plan trip, which Brian devised after a near accident on that prior trip like we talked about. He explained in detail how on December 16th, he lured Mike out to the lake, pushed him overboard, and when Mike didn't drown as expected, he shot him in the face with his shotgun. Brian's voice reportedly cracked as he described the moment of the murder, saying, quote, "I was in a panic. I didn't know what to do, and I ended up shooting him," end quote. He even reenacted for the jury how Mike was struggling and clinging to the stump as he pulled the trigger. That is so gut-wrenching. My heart just goes out to Mike because I cannot imagine what he was thinking in those final moments. The courtroom learned how thoroughly Brian and Denise went to cover up the crime. Brian said that he dumped Mike's body in the truck, left the boat, and within hours was at a family party acting distraught. He and Denise later discussed how to handle things. Brian admitted that 6 months later, he planted Mike's waders, jacket, and other items in the lake to support the accidental drowning story, which allowed Denise to get the death certificate and insurance money. The defense tried to cast doubt on the planting, but the condition of those items spoke for themselves. Brian chillingly described that he and Denise had an agreement to stay quiet forever. He said, quote, "We felt like as long as neither one of us talked, no one would ever find out what happened," end quote. Brian also addressed why he turned on Denise. He explained that the August 2016 kidnapping was an act of fear. He was terrified that Denise would betray him as they divorced, so he tried to scare her so she wouldn't turn on him. But when that went awry and he got arrested, he realized that the show was over. The kidnapping arrest was indeed his undoing. He knew either he or Denise would talk, so he decided to save himself and confess. In a dramatic moment on the stand, Brian looked right at Denise, sitting at the defense table, and said that he still loved her in some way, but he felt that she had left him no choice but to confess. He famously compared their partnership to outlaws, saying, quote, "We were Bonnie and Clyde. We were partners in crime," end quote. Brian's testimony was emotional and damning. Another powerful piece of evidence came from Kathy Thomas, formerly Kathy Winchester, Brian's first wife. Back in 2018, before Denise's arrest, Kathy had agreed to help investigators by recording a phone call with Denise. In this call, Kathy pretended to have knowledge about Mike's death. She told Denise that she knew what really happened to Mike. On the stand, Kathy testified, and the jury heard this call. Each time Kathy brought up Mike, Denise tried to change the subject or deflect, repeatedly steering the conversation far away from anything incriminating to do with her husband. At one point, an audibly nervous Denise asked Kathy, "What do you know?" The prosecution argued that this was not the reaction of an innocent person at all. An innocent widow would either have been confused by Kathy's suggestion or welcome new information. Denise's evasiveness and that telling question of "what do you know" suggested consciousness of guilt. It was as if Denise's first instinct was to gauge how much Kathy would have uncovered. Denise Williams' defense faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was to cast doubt on Brian's credibility and portray Denise as an innocent woman wrongfully accused by an admitted murderer. They argued that Brian Winchester was a liar and a criminal who had everything to gain by implicating Denise. After all, he got immunity for murder by pointing the finger at her. Ethan Way, Denise's attorney, emphasized that no physical evidence directly tied Denise to the crime. She wasn't present at the lake, and there were no documents or messages showing a murder plot from her. The case rested heavily on Brian's word, and Brian, they argued, wasn't trustworthy. They reminded the jury that Brian had literally kidnapped Denise in 2016, and that was hardly the act of someone trying to protect her, and much more like the act of a man unstable and capable of anything. The defense also pointed out that Denise never directly attempted to harm anyone herself. Yes, she married Brian, but marrying a friend after being widowed is not a crime. They tried to explain her behavior away with the insurance claim after 6 months. Maybe she truly believed that Mike was gone and that she needed to support her daughter financially. Not cooperating with Cheryl's search, perhaps due to animosity, not guilt. Changing the subject in Kathy's call, maybe Denise thought Kathy was just prying. The defense's challenge was that many small actions could be interpreted innocently, but together they formed a suspicious pattern. They needed to give the jury reasonable doubt, though. They floated the idea that Brian acted alone out of jealousy and was now falsely dragging Denise down with him. Denise herself did not testify. If you remember from the Jodi Ayers case that we covered, this is normal. It's abnormal to testify because then you're subject to a brutal cross-examination, which is not always a smart strategy when we're talking about life or death being on the line. After about 4 days of testimony, the case went to the jury in mid-December 2018. It didn't take them long, and on December 14th of that year, the verdict was returned. The jury found Denise Williams guilty on all counts. They were convinced that she had conspired with Brian to kill Mike and then help cover it up. The foreperson announced that Denise was guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. In interviews later, jurors indicated that Brian's testimony, corroborated by the forensic evidence and Denise's own suspicious actions, were persuasive. The cold logic of the plot and the huge insurance motive overcame the defense's attempt to paint Brian as solely responsible. Denise Williams stood in court as the verdict was read. She reportedly showed little to no emotion, maintaining the same stoic face that she had throughout the full trial. Her daughter Ansley, who was then in college at the time, was not in the courtroom. Denise's mother and sister sat stunned in the audience, having believed that Denise was innocent. Across the aisle, Cheryl Williams and all her supporters rejoiced quietly. Justice had finally been served. In February 2019, she was formally sentenced. The judge pronounced a sentence of life in prison on the murder count, plus an additional 30 years for the conspiracy to be served concurrently, and another 5 years for the accessory after the fact. It meant that Denise would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars with no possibility of parole. Denise, given an opportunity to address the court, declined to speak. She offered no apology or statement of innocence at that time. The most powerful moment at the sentencing came from when Cheryl Williams took the floor. After 18 years of fighting for this moment, Cheryl spoke directly to Denise, now a convicted murderer of Cheryl's son. Cheryl said, quote, "Justice has finally been served," end quote. And she said that Denise had not only taken her son Mike, but also robbed her of her granddaughter for all those years. Because Denise had been estranged from Ansley, Cheryl felt that she lost that relationship too. Denise was sentenced to Lowell Correction Institution, which is one of Florida's main prisons for women, but her legal saga was not completely over yet. Denise appealed her conviction, and in her appeal, she argued several points: that the evidence was insufficient to convict her, being a principal to murder, that certain testimony, like Brian's confession tape, should have been excluded, and so much more. In a surprising turn of events, Denise's appeal found partial success. In November 2020, the Florida First District Court of Appeal issued a ruling that overturned her first-degree murder conviction. The appellate judge held that the state had not proved that Denise was a principal to murder under Florida law. They stated that Brian Winchester was the one who actually pulled the trigger, and there was no evidence that Denise was physically present or directly aided in the act the moment that it happened. Florida's principal law requires that a person do some act or say some word that helps bring about the crime. The court wrote, quote, "Because Denise did not say or do anything to aid or abet Brian in the murder of Mike, and she did not counsel, hire, or procure Mike's murder beforehand, we reverse her conviction as a principal to first-degree murder," end quote. They believed that even if Denise plotted it, the way the law works, the evidence didn't show her actively participating in the murder itself enough to uphold a first-degree murder conviction. However, the appeals court did uphold her conviction for all the other charges. Denise's life sentence was voided, but she still faced that 30-year prison term for the conspiracy. In February 2021, Denise Williams was brought back to court for resentencing on the remaining charges. She received, again, that 30-year sentence for the conspiracy count, which was the maximum at the time, given the circumstances. Since she's already been in custody since 2018 and had credit for time served, her sentence effectively began from 2018. As of 2025, Denise Merle Williams is still incarcerated serving her 30-year prison term. She'll be approximately 76 years old at the earliest possible release date, assuming that no further reductions happen. Brian Winchester, now at the same age as Denise, continues to serve his 20-year prison sentence for kidnapping at Wakulla Correction Institution. He is scheduled to be released in 2036. Because Brian had immunity and Denise's murder conviction was overturned, it's technically true that legally no one has been convicted of the murder of Mike. It's a technical point, though, because the world now knows exactly what happened and who was responsible. The resolution of the case was bittersweet. Cheryl Williams finally got the truth and a measure of justice, but it took a really heavy toll on her. She spent nearly 2 decades consumed by this. She also started a Facebook page to keep Mike's memory alive and to help other families in missing person cases. Cheryl's relationship with her granddaughter Ansley remained strained or non-existent for a while, given that Ansley was raised around Denise's family and believed her mother wasn't capable of this level of evil. However, after Denise's conviction, Ansley, who was the beneficiary of Mike's insurance money via a trust, did receive the remaining insurance funds. Florida's Slayer statute prevents someone convicted of involvement in a murder from profiting from the victim's insurance, so any money that was left for Mike's policies would not go to Denise. Reports suggested that Ansley actually used some of that money to pay for her college. It's been said that Ansley, now in her mid-20s, has reconnected with her father's side of the family and might have a better understanding now of what transpired. For those who knew and loved Mike Williams, nothing can bring back the kind, hardworking man who truly adored his family and had so much life ahead of him. But at least after 18 agonizing years, the truth did come out. Mike did not drown in those lake waters of Lake Seminole. He was the victim of a cold-blooded murder plot, and now everyone knows it. As prosecutor John Fuchs said in his closing argument referencing Denise and Brian's plot, quote, "Obviously you can't be caught with a murder, so they had to make it look like an accident," unquote. They nearly got away with it, but in the end, justice prevailed. Mike Williams' story stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the worst crimes lurk behind the most innocent facades, and that unwavering love and persistence can bring even the darkest secrets to light. I pray that he's resting peacefully and that his daughter Ansley and his mother Cheryl are healing and flourishing despite all that they have endured. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for spending time with me today, as always. Don't forget to drop me a blue butterfly as our secret handshake if you made it to the end of the video. And take extra great care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders. I'll see you guys next time.